Well, thanks again for joining us today, everyone, and welcome to the second session in our preparation series for the 2024 Grad Thesis Slam. Today, we're going to cover a lot of topical areas. Kind of the core aspects of it was we're going to talk a lot about how to engage your audience and tell a compelling story, but that links from everything about thinking about how you hook your audience and engage them from the very beginning to having a story that you're telling them, and then even a takeaway message and thinking about slide design. So we're going to kind of cover a whole lot of areas we look forward into this series. And what that looks like today is we'll start by just recapping the timeline. We'll focus on the aspects of your audience that you really want to understand. We'll even kind of break down that a little bit for you, just to think about this non-technical audience of 100 plus, possibly 200 people that'll be in the room during the presentation. We'll think about the different parts of your presentation. It's only 3 minutes long, but you do want to have kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end to your talk, and kind of think about like how much time you might have for each of those and what you want to constructively do within that time. We'll talk about how you can have a really strong start. Kelly will break down kind of some different ways you can go about that. We'll highlight some other storytelling techniques that are good to consider and maybe incorporate into your presentation. Watch a couple example videos, and then we'll let you practice. So we have kind of two interactive activities that we're going to do throughout today's presentation. And just kind of a reminder of the timeline itself. Here we are in the second session already on Leap Day, the end of February, with April 16th, not that far away. Feels like the spring semester is moving really quick. Already kind of highlighted what today's presentation is about, but just as a reminder, we'll talk about slide design, presentation skills, the actual performance side of the Grad Thesis Slam in our next session, which will be halfway through March, so about 3 weeks away after we go through spring break. And then we have those practice sessions with some peer review. Just a reminder, if you can't attend one of those two dates in kind of the 21st, 22nd timeframe of March, you can set up an individualized advising appointment with Kelly and me to actually do that practice session. It is a requirement that you either participate in one of these practice sessions or you meet with us. So just don't forget to schedule that. And the preliminary rounds. We have been working with a great group of about 25 UVA contacts, colleagues of ours, that are going to be participating as judges for the initial round of the competition. We have identified the dates and times Monday all the way through Friday, that week of the 1st to the 5th, and we'll be announcing those soon so we can advertise those to you. You can let us know what your availability is if you want to compete in the competition, and we'll start identifying, kind of locking in those dates so they're on your schedule. So to dive in just a little bit deeper with what we're going to do over this next series as we look forward to that preliminary competition, today's session, what we really want you to do at heart is kind of reflect on your graduate work. What's kind of the big picture aspects of your work that connect to people, members of the audience, maybe more broadly to society. Think about the issues that you're working on, thinking about the problems you're trying to solve, et cetera, and making that connection to why the audience that'll be sitting in the room, and specifically the judges as you're competing in the competition, why they should care and how your research directly connects to them. In the next session, we'll kind of help you outline a little bit more of that draft story and take that research story you want to tell and start to think about your script and how you're going to communicate it, and start to think about, what information that you're going to share, what is going to be left kind of on the cutting room floor that you're not going to have time to present, and making sure you have the most important elements there. And that hook and that takeaway message being two of those really important things. And then we want you to start thinking about your slide design. What are the visuals that actually help you complement the story you're telling? What are those extra pieces of information the audience really needs to understand what your presentation is about? And of course, there's some simplicity, some kind of ways you want to design that, but that's where we're going for the next session. So Kelly.
Yeah, so last time we asked you to think about a few things, and we're going to talk about these later, but just to call them back to your attention and get you thinking about them right now as we talk through some of these strategies that can help you better communicate your research. Some of the things we asked you to think about were why should your audience care about your graduate work? And you care a lot about your work, and your advisor cares a lot about your work. People within your field probably have some reasons to care. But why should a general audience care about your work? So that means taking this big satellite view of your research. How does it connect to others? What are the various ways that you can think of that connection? How can it relate to current events, things that people know about or that's fresh on their minds, pop culture, et cetera. And then what is the big picture problem or issue or unknown aspect you're addressing? So what is the actual substance of your research about, and how are you changing something with this research? And finally, what is something about your research that is not obvious to someone outside your discipline? Thinking about this right now can help you think about what are the surprising elements of my research that I can share, or what are the necessary components that I need to share in order for somebody to understand this research. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about the nuances of that question of what you need to share, what background you have to give. But thinking about that now can help you kind of narrow down or home in on the things that are really necessary to share. Because again, you only have 3 minutes, so you want to make sure that everything that you're giving your audience is necessary, but also making sure that they have what they need to understand what you're talking about, basically. Next slide. Yeah, so if you've been to any of our programming in the past, you know, we love to talk about audience and we love to talk about it first and incessantly because it's so important. It's everything, basically. How you craft your message is determined by who you're speaking to. So when you think about the audience for the grad thesis slam, you first want to ask, well, who are they? They're a general audience. They are probably made up of people from the university community, the local community, friends and family, people who've been invited, people from departments of the participants, the presenters. They're probably relatively well educated if they're from the university community, obviously, but you know, being a college town, there's probably a big affiliation with higher education. So that might tell you a little bit about who that audience is in particular. What do they already know? What do they already know about your topic, but also in general? So think about somebody who has maybe a college education or a high school education. What have they been taught about something related to your topic? What might have been the last class that they took in your field? And what is that kind of base level knowledge that everybody shares about your field? You can use that to figure out what you don't need to cover or what you can draw on in order to build on that with your specific research. How do they get their information? So do they listen to NPR? Do they read a newspaper? Do they get all of their information from Twitter or Reddit or something like that? Figuring out that or thinking about that can help you better understand the types of information or the different types of presenting information that appeals to that audience. What are they just gradually, or what do they gravitate towards to get their information, and why? Is it something about the way that information is packaged, the stories that are told in those formats? That can give you some intel to shape your own message to be appealing to that audience. And finally, what are their beliefs and interests? So we're going to talk a lot about appeal. You want to make sure that you are not boring your audience. You're keeping them engaged for that entire 3 minutes. And one way that you can do that is to think about how your topic relates to these beliefs and interests, these preconceived ideas that they might have about your research topic, or maybe a personal experience that they have that is related to your topic, or an interest that you can build off of to get them interested in your topic. So all of these are ways that you can think about who that audience is and how you're actually going to appeal to them and get them interested. And remember that people are just naturally curious. So even if you don't really know what your audience knows or doesn't know, you can probably bet that they're going to be curious about something, or they have the potential to be curious. So how are you going to engage that curiosity and get them to want to know more about your topic? Kind of starting us off with something intriguing that makes us want to listen through to the end. that can be any number of things in any of these topics. So think about what that opening bit is going to be. That's going to kind of draw us through to that takeaway message that you leave us with at the end. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those possible opening tactics are, as well as look at some examples. But also remember that humans just naturally remember and share experiences through stories. We're storytelling creatures. That's how we communicate things. That's how we kind of put order to the chaos of experience and how we process it and make sense of it. So engage that and give your own presentation a story in some way. Think about that kind of A to B to C structure in terms of maybe a plot structure or something that again engages our interest and takes us through and delivers on that interest by the end. And think about your words, visuals, and performance together. So like Sam said, we're going to be talking about slide design and the visual elements of your presentation in session 3. But you really want to be thinking about that from the beginning, because all of these things play into each other. The gestures that you use can communicate a lot. The pauses that you use when you're talking can communicate a lot or can engage us in a specific way. The visuals especially are really important. So think about those things and how they all complement each other and how they're communicating in different ways to create this more multifaceted message that you want to get across. And remember, it's always easier to learn new information by building on your current knowledge. So you want to teach your audience something, and let's say you want to teach them about some aspect of, outer space and the chemical makeup of the rings of Saturn. That's the example I always go to, because that's really all I know about space, is that there's rings in Saturn. You're not going to help your audience understand and remember what you're telling them if you're giving them a lot of kind of really densely scientific stuff that doesn't connect in any way to what they already know. So figure out what they already know and build on that. So think about what is their framework of knowledge. Maybe the last time they learned about the planets was like me in like 9th grade. So what is that 9th grade understanding? It's, well, there's rings in Saturn. So where do we go from there? Instead of dumping a lot of really dense scientific concepts onto me, how are you going to kind of build on what I already know to get me to that message that you want to send? And that brings us to this idea of a knowledge paradigm. So this is exactly what we're talking about here, understanding where your audience is starting and getting them where you want to go. So everything you know and understand about your field of expertise colors how you think and communicate it. And we love to use this cartoon of this police officer who is giving instructions or directions to this person from out of town on how to get somewhere. And because the police officer has been walking these streets for 20 years and knows this city like the back of his hand, he is able to give step-by-step perfect instructions to get there. But for the out-of-towner who has no framework of knowledge of this city, no way to put those directions into context, this turns into a jumble in his head. It's a right, it's a left, it's a right. But what does that really mean? I can't visualize it because I've never been here and I don't know the landmarks. I don't know everything that I need to know to understand those directions. And that's the case for explaining complicated academic research as well. You need to understand that your audience doesn't have that same background as you. The core scientific knowledge or historical background of your field, or the knowledge of the critical debates that are shaping the research that you're doing. They don't necessarily know the acronyms that you're talking about and the jargon and technical terms. And we're going to talk a little bit about jargon because that's really important to avoid and to understand what is jargon in your field versus what is something that we can rely on our audience to know. Always default on the side of they don't know, and you need to simplify it for them and explain it to them, or figure out whether that explanation is worth the time that you have, because again, you only have 3 minutes. So think about that. What are the things that are are forming your own concepts of what you study, the things that you can't even understand without all of the years of study that you've had. And how can you kind of back up to say something in a way that somebody without that level of expertise can understand?
So we actually want to kind of do that in practice right now. We want to use the Zoom chat, and we want you to think of one word. It doesn't have to be a word you necessarily use within your grad thesis land presentation, but something you do frequently use in conversations with your lab group, something that's really common to your discipline, that you would expect this non-technical grad thesis slam audience to know. And the way we want you to share this is, once you don't hit send yet, or don't hit return, but we want you to use the chat to actually write out that word, and then in parentheses, define what your discipline is, and put an asterisk next to it if you'd be willing to share. So for example, if I were to do this, I would use a word like mesohaline. My academic background is in marine science, and of course, I'm always happy to share. So that's what I would type in. So take a minute, think of a word, and then when you're ready, you can go ahead and put it in. And Alexis, thank you for putting an asterisk on there. And Kelly and I are going to discuss a couple of these. We might even try to define them in our own terms if we have any idea what they may mean. It might be really dangerous because we come from different disciplines too. And then we might do this again.
We have the Odyssey. Am I pronouncing that right, Brittany? Okay, yeah, the Odyssey. If I were to just hear that and not see it spelled, I would think I was saying the Odyssey of Homer.
For Natalie's, I see free indirect discourse. So
I know that one.
I would, yeah, that's why I wanted to take that one. So, okay, I'll probably do a terrible job of this, but I would say in an open space where you could come together for arguments. Not terrible, maybe? I'm just judging this on Kelly's reaction.
Not exactly.
Biofidelity, I would say something that maybe would, given the discipline is mechanical engineering, maybe something that could be used within the environment, maybe within a body if it was more of bioengineering. And there's a length of time that it's viable and usable before it would decompose or no longer be usable for like an implant.
Corey, is that yours?
Yeah, we use this term a lot we have a lot of mechanical ways to model how the body moves, and how close our models are to the actual human response is what we typically call biofidelity. So you had the gist. So the fidelity part is kind of like how faithful it is to the human response, if you think about your lab roots.
Kelly slash, look back now. Natalie, how close was I? Did you actually define what it was, or would you?
Yeah, free and direct discourse is it's a narrative style, so it's like a way of writing and a way of kind of narrating through multiple perspectives, and kind of like a narrator who can float through people and time, or people and places, I guess.
Okay, so you heard Kelly and I try to define some of these terms. Now what we want you to do is actually define your own jargon. I want you to share your word again, but this time include a definition that I could understand about your research, kind of in plain terms. You know, make sure that you're not defining your jargon with other jargon, or defining it with something that's highly technical or really complex and hard to follow. So your definition, you know, should just be a couple words, should not have commas in it, should not need additional definitions of your definition. See what you can do.
And Mel, I see you had an asterisk by yours. So if you wanna tell us about, is that a Latin term?
Yeah, it's a Latin legal term. Just put the explanation in the chat window.
Great. Yeah, that's one of those things. We like to talk about the difference between jargon that's strictly jargon and things that are more technical terms. And I think a lot of those things that are Latinate are more like technical terms because they're so precise to what you're talking about. But again, nobody knows it unless you've been trained in it. Oh, yes, when allowed. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
As I say, the reason we like to do this is one is we do recognize as we work with graduate students all the time that sometimes you do want to include your jargon or technical terms for various reasons. One is it's shorthand for a more complex definition. And if you would have to continue to define something or refer to it without that shorthand, that could actually make your presentation longer. So sometimes it's okay to have just a little bit, and I mean like one word of jargon that you want to use because it actually helps you present your presentation easier. But as you're seeing, you have to define it because this diverse audience that we have today won't necessarily know what the definition is, or more dangerously, might have a different definition than you do for your same jargon. So my question to all of you as we kind of continue to read some of these and reflect on a little bit is, as you think to yourself, does your definition that you've put into the chat, does it actually include the most important aspect for your audience to understand? And I mean that it's not just a definition of the word, but it defines the word in the context that you would actually be including it in your presentation as you're referring to the word or using the word within your script. So definitely keep in mind, not just the fact that you might want to use a word and you need to define it, but you need to have an analogy, an example, a definition that is short, quick, but is also applied for that audience to understand throughout your presentation. Because you don't want to complicate things by defining something, but not giving the context they need to understand how you're going to continue to be using it.
And Natalie, thanks for that much more precise definition of free and direct discourse. I knew I was muddling it somehow.
And for those watching the back end of this on the recording, Natalie's definition was a technique where the narrator uses the voice of a character and sees into their head without truly switching point of view. And I love that very descriptive definition because it's something, if you close your eyes and you kind of listen to, you can actually visualize that example through that definition and the way it's written. The other question that I want to ask all of you, and this is, feel free to unmute yourself. If you are seeing a term in the chat that you actually use within your discipline, but now that you're seeing how someone else defines it, they're defining it differently. So Natalie and Kelly kind of gave us a good example of this in some ways because both coming from similar disciplinary backgrounds defined a term slightly different.
That was just because I forgot.
That's okay. It worked out perfectly for the example, though.
Yeah. I could say for literary studies, we wouldn't use the word pre-malignant, but if I were, I would use it to describe a character who hasn't turned into a villain yet. He's in the pre-malignant.
I like that definition.
Yeah.
That's actually kind of similar to how we would use it in my field. It's a cell that has not yet become a tumor, but has all of the right ingredients too.
Yeah, that's great.
It's almost kind of a fun analogy in that way. That's cool. An example that I often give is one that I actually experienced. I was leading a training focused on interdisciplinary collaborative science. And we were all doing introductions. There was a lot of faculty members and people that were running research programs. And I introduced myself as an ecosystem ecologist. And about 5 people later, a faculty member from the School of Education also introduced themselves, and he described himself as a kind of an ecosystem modeler, so a somewhat similar term. And with that, we kept talking, kind of going through the day, and at one point, we kept using the term ecosystem modeling. And I looked at him and I went, wait, you're using a term that I use all the time, but I define it as a numerical simulation of an ecosystem. Like I have a computer program that simulates what's happening within the Chesapeake Bay and the water quality and all these other things that happen within the bay. You don't mean the same thing I mean. And absolutely, he did not. His definition of ecosystem modeling, as somebody that's in the School of Education, was actually how the classroom was designed to create a learning environment for the students. We had spent a half day using the same exact term, never defining it, and sitting there trying to figure out what each other was referring to when we kept using that same jargon over and over, and it didn't fit with our conceptual models, our disciplinary differences, our definitions that we used and referred to all the time. So it's really important to keep in mind that some of this jargon that you have might be jargon that other people use within their discipline, but it just means something completely different from the other discipline. So this is why it can be really helpful to have friends that are in other graduate schools and other departments, coming and talking to Kelly and I and using any terms that you might be using. This is one of the reasons we do the practice session. So we can help you identify some of these things that might confuse or trip up your audience, especially given the audience that we have for the Grad Thesis Slam. And here's kind of another example of that. It doesn't have to be technical jargon. It can be words that we're all very familiar with, but a non-technical kind of general audience might have a very specific definition that 75% of the population thinks about when they think of modeling. They probably don't think of me, the person that does, coastal ecology work and has a model that represents the Chesapeake Bay, right? They have a very different definition of what that is. And I really love the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, has this sharing science space. If you're working in a STEM discipline, sometimes these can be really fun, especially if you're in kind of the natural resources or sciences. And then another term that we use a lot, right, is mean. Most people don't think of, an average or statistical analysis when they're thinking of mean. They just think of someone who is mean, who's cruel, right? So we have to make sure that you're thinking about even the simpler terms that you're using within your script. And this is really important because within 3 minutes, you can't afford to lose your judge or the audience, even for 3 or 5 seconds, as they're kind of grappling with the word that you used within what they think you mean before they understand what you actually mean. Because that's 5, maybe 10 seconds that they stopped paying attention to your presentation. And you can't afford to lose them for that long. So as you're thinking about your script, as you're thinking about the terms you're using, make sure the terms you're using are common, they're concrete. The majority of the population is going to have a single definition for that. They're going to understand exactly what you mean when they hear that word. And another really important thing is make it conversational. Envision that you're actually having a research conversation with your audience. It's 3 minutes long. You can almost envision this as the introduction of your research to an audience that's going to be a back and forth conversation about your research after you finish presenting. People are going to want to ask you questions. They're going to want to hear more because it was only 3 minutes. You can't get into all the details. It's really the start of a conversation about your research, and you want it to be engaging, informing, and inspiring that next set of questions that follow up after your presentation. Okay, so what does 3 minutes look like when we actually put it down on paper and start to break down 3 minutes? Well, first, we've already highlighted the fact that you do want to have a start, a middle, and an end to your presentation. That start is probably going to be some kind of hook, something that's going to capture your audience's attention. And you need to do that probably within 30 seconds and kind of start to move on to the middle at that point, maybe 45, but no longer. You don't want to waste a 30-year presentation on capturing the audience's attention. You have to wrap it up much faster than that. The middle of your presentation, this is going to be where you inform your audience. There's an engagement piece where you're keeping them engaged throughout that. You're only giving them the important information they need to understand about your research, to understand the story arc that we're referring to, or that carries you from the start all the way to the end and your kind of take-home message. And then in that last 30 seconds, you want to wrap up the presentation. You want to come full circle with where you started at the beginning. You kind of want to put a bow on your presentation. Hopefully, you're wrapping this up with something memorable. Maybe it's a call to action. It's an offer by you to the audience to learn more about what you do and to kind of stay engaged. So as we think about these, over the next couple slides, I'm going to break them down. We're going to come back a lot to the start because that hook, that beginning is so very, very important. So your hook can be a whole lot of things. And as we said, we'll even give more information on some of these. But to give you an idea of some broad terms you can think about a provocative statement. We got an example of one of these in the videos that we'll show you. It could be something that's surprising, something that could be a shock statement, like the fact that bananas are radioactive. I don't know how many people knew that bananas are radioactive, but that would capture my attention because I ate one at about 7:30 this morning. And if I'm putting radioactive material into my body, I'd actually be kind of interested in that. You can ask your audience the question, when was the last time you did this? And these can be questions that your audience can actually answer. And you can ask people to, by show of hands, who has done this before, right? You can start to engage them in those ways. You can captivate them in a story. I could say, 3 years ago when I was laying in the backyard, staring up at the stars with my 6-year-old daughter, I saw something flash through the sky. And you might want to stick around to hear what was flashing through the sky, right? Like what inspired me after that to do the research that I do. And of course, you have your slide. You could do something that's really impactful, a visual. We have a few examples of those as well. Something that is either in really big font that might just stand out and kind of burn into their memory, or it could be something that just captivates somebody's attention. And of course, you can do visual exercises. You could ask your audience to close their eyes and imagine a time when, or imagine this process, or think about a certain thing, and actually have that kind of call to action, but let them mentally come up with what that image might look like to them. And potentially, you can contrast that right away by using your slide or describing something completely different and change that paradigm that they might naturally think of. So like I said, we'll explore some more of these tactics a little more in a second. For the middle of your presentation, you really are using that 90 seconds to 2 minutes to identify the problems, kind of highlight those research questions that you're working on. You got to limit this to 2 to 3 main points. Honestly, that's about all the time you have to share information. I mean, even if each of these main points is kind of 30 seconds to introduce, you're pretty much getting towards the end of your presentation at that point. Of course, the middle has to make that connection. It bridges from the beginning to the end. And this is where you really need to be careful, because this is the part where people start to want to naturally bring in extra details, especially on the fly. Rely on their jargon, rely on terms, because maybe you start to get nervous, you haven't practiced enough. Maybe you're like, oh, I think this is really important. I want to include some methods, some technical description, something like that. You got to be really careful not to include that. And I'll just asterisk this real quick, which is people, especially people that are not from your discipline or are a non-technical audience, those details about methods, the exact thing that you're doing. Going back to Kelly's slide, we don't have the technical understanding, the foundational kind of framework to understand why those methods, what you chose to do, how that might be different than something else. It's things that we don't remember, we don't hold on to. And for this short presentation, it's not necessarily something you need to include. And then the end, this is really to kind of help your audience wrap things up, but also feel like they took something away from your presentation. This can be something that's like really impactful, a key statement, a question even to the audience of like, don't you want to make a difference? Here's how, right? Don't you want to be engaged? Join me, be a part of my research. It can be something that's really memorable, a catchphrase, a jingle, something like that, that just helps them remember what the key point was. And of course, I already kind of highlighted the fact that it can be an action. It can be something that's actually inspiring your audience to do something now that they've learned about your research.
Okay, so I want to look at some examples of strong starts. This is probably the most important part of your presentation to get us interested from the start. If you don't get your audience interested right away, it's going to be hard to get them interested in the middle. So how can we start really strong and communicate in a very brief way what this presentation is going to be all about and how is it going to be relevant to your audience. So we've cultivated some tactics here, 8 of them, and some examples that I've taken mostly from The Conversation, which is a website where academics write about academic research, but in an engaging way for a broader audience. So I thought these are great examples of how to do this, even though it's a longer format than you would be doing with a 3-minute thesis. So one way is to, or sorry, grad thesis slam, I can't call it the 3-minute thesis. Okay, so one way is to begin with the ending. So what is the end of all of this? This example here, and I apologize, some of these are a bit dated. This is from last year, but it was talking about the war in Ukraine. And the first sentence is, most military analysts expected Ukraine to fall within days when Russia launched its invasion on February 24th, 2022. Yet 1 year into the war, Ukrainians have put up a fight and demonstrated remarkable resolve against a powerful military. And then by the end, in my view, as a career U.S. Special Forces officer, the war is not yet close to a stalemate. So what this person is doing is evoking what we expected the ending to be. So not necessarily predicting what the end is going to be, but calling to attention the fact that a lot of people thought, and the experts thought, something was going to happen and it hasn't happened. And so here's what I think is going to happen. So you're beginning with what the end is going to look like, and pointing to the uncertainty that we have around that right now. But the best, what my research does, this person says, it points to this being the outcome. Next example. So another way to start is to tell a personal story that demonstrates an important, relevant point. So this person makes art using plastic recovered from beaches. And she begins, I am obsessed with plastic objects. I harvest them from the ocean for the stories they hold and to mitigate their ability to harm. Each object has the potential to be a message from the sea, a poem, a cipher, a metaphor, a warning. And then she starts to get into the work that she does with this. And it starts off, that first sentence is very personal. I am obsessed with plastic objects. Of all the ways that she could have started, that one really grabs us by showing her interest and her motivation to do this work. And that can be really powerful to help your audience get interested. So why are you obsessed with plastic objects? That's such an interesting way to present your interests, and an interesting thing to be interested in. So now I'm curious and want to know more. And we're going to talk more about this later, how to use a personal story to start. But another one, yeah, you can go to the next one, is to tell a general story or an anecdote or an analogy to demonstrate the point. And so this person starts off with a very brief kind of imagine this scenario. It's been a warm day, maybe even a little humid, and the tall clouds in the distance remind you of cauliflower. You hear a sharp crack like the sound of a batter hitting a home run, or a low rumble reminiscent of a truck driving down the highway. A distant thunderstorm alive with lightning is making itself known. And so this story is all about research on lightning. And this opening paragraph evokes a lot of different images, not only the image of a rainstorm and lightning, but also these comparisons to other things. So we have kind of analogies within a story that grab us in different ways and help us visualize this in different ways. So the sound of a batter hitting a home run, the truck driving down the highway, all of these are things that we can connect to and that we know about. And these kind of put us, help to put us actually in the place of this rainstorm coming in a lot of different ways. I just really love that example. And note, this is not a personal story because, you know, the other personal story is that the other example, but this is more of a kind of connecting to us through putting us in a situation, basically.
And I love this example because it gives some like visual context to kind of frame the environment around the research for the audience, like, right? So they can mentally imagine this. They can go back to their own lived experiences and think about, oh, I remember being in a similar situation. So it's really nice. It kind of sets the stage for where this research is happening in a very relatable, you know, everybody's been in a storm at some point in their life, or at least most people, I would assume.
Yeah. And as you go to the next one, I'll just add that, you know, we talk about storytelling in research communication as a way to put your research on the human level, to put a human face to it and a human experience. And that's, this is a great example of that, to connect with the human experience for something that's probably a more abstract type of research, you know, however they actually do what they're doing. Another way is to start with a quotation. So this example is from a PhD student here at UVA, who I think has since graduated, but she wrote this op-ed for the Washington Post on anti-Asian violence, and begins the end of the first paragraph with this quote from, in response to a spate of highly publicized attacks on Asian American people and businesses, Carl Chan addressed California Governor Gavin Newsom. The situation is dire. We want you to bring in the California Highway Patrol. So this gets into the idea that the police might not be the solution to this, but she begins by evoking the very emotional and strong opinion of somebody who is living through this and what they think. And then in the next paragraph, she'll address that more and kind of unpack it. But that helps to, again, put a human face to it, put a human experience to it in a way that can engage us. But be careful with quotes. I have taught so much freshman composition classes, and they do the, you know, the high school research paper thing where you begin with a quote from Einstein and go from there, and the quotes of course never have anything to do with the actual paper. So I don't predict that's what any of you will do, but try to avoid things that might have become cliches or that could appear on listicles. Just really be strategic in what you're using and why.
I'll say during the competition last year and kind of the prep series too, we saw people start to use quotes, but it took them a while to come back around and kind of share their perspective, their opinion, their thought that might contrast or agree with what that quote was. So it kind of left the audience at the beginning wondering, like, well, how do you, the researcher, feel about this? You know, if it's not done in a way that's like showing motivation for doing the work that you're doing, but it's somebody else's opinion and their words, that takes away from your 3 minutes. So be really careful about how you may use them. And if you do have a quote that's somebody else's opinion, you know, you might want to think about defining like how you feel about that or why your approach is different. Because we are vested, you know, our interest is in you, the presenter, not somebody who's not there giving that presentation that day.
And so the fifth tactic, a rhetorical question, and we've seen this done really well in some of the presentations that we've seen lately. So this example, when was the last time you walked into a public space and didn't hear someone coughing? After 3 years of flinching at the sound, it can be disarming to hear so many people coughing and embarrassing if it's you. So it's, again, evoking a very vivid picture. You can remember the last time you were in a public space and someone's coughing, and especially if this was a few years ago, the reaction you would have had, maybe still have. And it's not a question meant to be answered, but something that's evoking more for the audience. Those questions of, yeah, I know what that experience is like. I know what it's like to be the person coughing and being worried that people are going to think that I'm contagious or something. And that simple question evokes a lot. So rhetorical questions can be really powerful and a quick way to get things going. And then number 6, project into the future. So this one, I think it's not right at the beginning, but towards the end of that first paragraph, it says, so the ocean's carbon pump, part of the natural ocean processes that capture about 1/3 of all human-produced carbon dioxide and sink it into the deep sea, where it remains for hundreds of years. And then the next paragraph also kind of looks at that future. There may be ways to enhance these processes so the ocean pulls more carbon out of the atmosphere to help slow climate change, yet little is known about the consequences. So we have this process that is, this whatever sinks and remains for hundreds of years. We have a very, very long time in the future that this is going to be impacted by this. And then we have another vision of the future where there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's going to be the topic here about what we don't know about that future. And that can be a really good way to engage through just the curiosity of why don't we know, how can we know, and what are the consequences of that not knowing. So evoking that and any image of the future can be a great way. And then there is looking into the past, and that's easy to do if you deal with a topic that is historically based. Of course, the whole thing will be about the past probably, but there are ways to do that too with other types of research, maybe looking at the history of the thing that you study in some way and how things were different in the past versus how they are now or how you want them to be going forward. In this example, in medieval Europe, views of women could often be summed up in 2 words, sinner or saint. And of course, this is all about historical research, but that immediately gets us interested, like, oh, this is something like unique to that period of time that is going to be dealt with here, and it's very succinctly stated. And then we have
I was just saying, it goes back a little bit to that provocative statement idea too, that we were highlighting a little bit earlier as kind of a hook. Like, you could state that, pause, let your audience grapple with that for a moment, and then go on and actually talk about your work and scholarship within this area.
Yeah, and that can either be something known about the past, something that wouldn't be so much of a surprise, like this probably wouldn't come as a huge surprise to people, or it can be something that we didn't know about the past that is surprising and gets us interested in that way. And then the next one is a blend of the two, combining past and future. And I included this because I found this example that I thought was so great. Imagine Lady Gaga or Elton John teaching at an orphanage or homeless shelter, offering daily music lessons. And I thought that was unique because well, I guess it doesn't combine past and future, it combines past and present, but it still helps us think about the current day in relation to the past in a way that helps us better understand this thing that this person is going to talk about that past. So that's what took place at Venice's 4 Ospedali Grandi, which were charitable institutions that took in the needy. So this actually happened in 16th century to the turn of the 19th century. And that, putting in the context of something we know, made it really understandable immediately. And then the 8th tactic is also using humor, which is, as we know, a great way to get people engaged, get people listening. All the best speakers do this in some way. And this opening is also kind of funny in thinking about Lady Gaga or Elton John doing this kind of work. It's funny because it's unexpected, and that can be a really great way to get us engaged.
Here, I thought you were going to have some kind of punchline about the fact that Lady Gaga would consider Elton John old and historic.
No, I'll let you take that joke.
Bad jokes all the way around. Well, what are some other techniques that you can potentially use, and what are some other considerations you should really have in mind? Well, first is, as we talk about research story, and we keep coming back to like story and storytelling, well, within that space, you need a character, right? Someone your audience can kind of empathize with, someone that they can envision like facing some of the struggles, the hardships, sitting in the lab, working within the library, like actually doing the research. Now, that can be you, but it could also be somebody else, or it could be something that you kind of work with as well. For example, as we were talking about Carolyn last year, I'm sorry, 2 weeks ago, we had an image of Carolyn talking about her research up on stage with a photo of herself in the background, standing inside this car, crash test dummies strapped to the seats, and she was visually a character within her own research story. You could also envision her kind of twist that and actually talk about the crash test dummies themselves being all male, except for the fact that now she's bringing in a female crash test dummy, right? So she could actually create characters within her own story. There's a couple ways to do that. We talked a little bit already about the fact that just giving us context, describing that space where the research is actually being done, where the work is actually happening, with that great language that Kelly had a little bit earlier about, lightning strikes and the crack of the bat and that sound of thunder and the rumbling of a storm coming in, right? That like describes the place where that research was being done. In this context, we have two images here, Doc Brown and Marty out in a mall parking lot driving a remote control time machine, right? Like the fact that you can describe that setting where that work is taking place, or Indiana Jones having this kind of dual role of scholarship, right? One of those is being actually in and at an academic institution, a classroom, teaching about, the archaeology, the finds, and everything that they've done in that other role that Indiana Jones is so famous for, which is actually being in the field with a whip and a hat and actually doing the work and finding discoveries. So those places and that setting really can be important to like captivating your audience and giving them that context. And of course, there's other techniques. Those pauses that we talked about can be one example. The way we kind of set up our story, we have intrigue kind of built into it. And as I'm putting up this cartoon, and hopefully you're reading and kind of following along with it, it doesn't pop up all at once. I'm creating tension, right? So there's elements of this that you can incorporate in, whether it's your script and how you're giving your presentation, what you're putting on the screen, what the audience is able to see or not able to see. There's ways you can use the visuals that are behind you and on the slide to kind of actually play into this. You can describe danger or a situation within that hook and then come back to resolve and safety at the end. There's a lot of ways to kind of build some of these aspects in. And it's really important too, especially within this 3 minutes, that you do offer your audience the right amount of detail, right? You are not going to be able to give a presentation on your entire graduate, dissertation or thesis, right? Like we don't have time for that. It's 3 minutes. There's only so much information that you can share. So you're going to have to focus your presentation on something that you can present within that time. Provide your audience the information that they need to understand what you're doing and the impact and the outcomes that you're aiming for. So if you give them too little information, and I feel like my daughter is famous for giving us stories that don't have the backstory that we need to understand the punchline that she's going for, then we don't understand. We sit there, scratching our heads and asking questions and trying to get the information after we've heard the story that was what we needed to know to be able to understand what she was trying to tell us, or the joke that she was trying to tell us. On the other hand, if you give too much information, well, most likely you're just going to run out of time. You've only got 3 minutes. So if you go past giving us like 2 to 3 pieces of important information in the middle of your talk, then you're just not going to get to your takeaway message. You're not going to be able to wrap up the end of your presentation on time. And we don't want that to happen because, of course, that makes you ineligible for the competition because you've exceeded your 3 minutes. As humans too, we love satisfying endings. Think about almost every single movie you've ever seen, right? Rom-coms, murder mysteries, everything. We want it to wrap up by the end. It might be a funny takeaway. It might be something that pulls on our emotional strings. It moves us. It reveals, going back to like Scooby-Doo, we find out who the masked person was in the end. We have that resolution towards the end. Or it could be something that's empowering to us as an audience, right? It lets us actually make decisions. different choices than maybe we otherwise would if we hadn't been there for your presentation. So try to give tie that start all the way back in the end. You're coming full circle, but give us the resolution to whatever you might have posed to us in your hook, in your opening. And I encourage you, don't just give us a story to give us a story to kind of hold your research together, but think about that story as an example, as a way you can empower your audience. So just to kind of give you a couple examples, we talked about some of these already, but, let us know what your new insight is. How does that impact the discipline? How does that move society forward? Think about the actionable information that we could use in our everyday lives. Maybe it just changes our perspective. Maybe the next time we read something, watch something, interact in our communities, maybe we'll think about something differently because of the presentation you give. It could also give us context for something that we hadn't thought about before, or hope for what the future might bring. Medical research, new innovations, engineering, something that addresses climate change. You can give us hope even if you're not solving those answers. You do need to be really careful in this space though too, because you don't want to overpromise. I'll go back to the cancer research kind of ideas. You might not be solving cancer, right? And you're probably not going to solve cancer alone, but you might be contributing towards research that's helping us understand something about cancer. And that's going to go to the collective discipline to hopefully come up with solutions down the line. Right? So don't overpromise yourself as a superhero. Captivate us within the great story you already have to tell about your specific contribution.
Yeah, so we have some questions here that can help you brainstorm what your story might be, story or stories. What are the aspects of this that you can use to be engaging? And we're going to make sure you have these slides so you can look at these in more detail and actually do some brainstorming. But just briefly, some questions are, what inspired you to do this research? That moment of inspiration or that series of moments that led up to your decision to study this can help better communicate what that importance is of actually studying this. Why did you decide to devote so much time to this? And also show that story of you coming to that realization, which could be interesting. What problems or opportunities can your research address? So again, looking at what is the hope in this? What is the outcome of, and what is the problem you're trying to solve? What's the gap between what's known and what you hope to learn? What eventful things, discoveries have happened in your work so far? Again, this is asking you to look at your actual process of research and the waypoints along that path of things that you've been excited to find out, that you have uncovered, or that you've come up with, and also, what are the setbacks that have happened? When you think about that hero's journey, you always want that person to be encountering difficulties and overcoming them. So what have those been for your own work? Why would a 90-year-old curious person care about your work? So think about, somebody who has seen it all, who's lived a full life, who's still interested in learning new things, but has seen a lot of things. What would that person be interested in? That can help you think about engaging things that everybody else would find interesting. How could your research, even if it is basic, potentially change the world? Now, I'm going to assume that calling research basic isn't an insult, not knowing that world of research. But think about any type of research. What is that potential impact that it can have? What are the most unexpected or interesting things you discovered or learned during your research? What has surprised even you, who has been trained in this for years? What makes your research interesting to your friends? So just think about the last time you talked about what you studied with friends, whether in your field or out. Probably more meaningfully outside of your field, what has gotten them interested? And if you haven't talked to friends about your research, we encourage you to do that now to find out what they're interested in, see where their eyes glaze over and they want to change the subject, or see what they ask questions about. That can be a great way to gauge your audience's interest and figure out what would be compelling in the grad thesis slam scenario.
Sometimes it's helpful to talk to your advisor too, because when you're doing a lot of grant writing, especially for, larger kind of federal agencies or sometimes nonprofits, you really have to think about the broader impacts, like why it matters to society and pitch it. So, if you're working under a grant that your faculty member originally submitted, it'd be really interesting too to know, like, how did you pitch this and what the contribution and why it matters is. That can give you a little context too that you might not already have about your own research.
And now we want to look at some examples of strong starts and looking at some of the things that we've already talked about. And so Sam is going to pull these up. And the first we're going to look at is beginning with an anecdote or story. And I want you to pay attention to the length of this story and what it is about it that is interesting or impactful.
1 in 6 people in the world suffer from diseases that affect the brain. 1 in 6. When I was growing up, my first 1 in 6 observation was my grandfather when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. We were able to visit him monthly, and each month I saw a bit of his memory being taken away by this unforgiving disease. Not only Alzheimer's, but diseases like schizophrenia, Parkinson's, and migraines are so debilitating because they affect the way information transfer happens in the body. My research focuses on 3 proteins that act as these little machines to allow information transfer to occur in the building blocks of our brain. These proteins have names that are quite complex, so I'll be referring to them as machines. When these machines interact, a message is released. This process happens over and over until the message reaches its intended target, allowing our brain to function. This phenomenon is occurring constantly in our bodies, and it allows us to do things like think, dream, and love. Scientists have studied this topic for many years, but they cannot agree on the order in which these 3 interact. I believe we must define the order of interactions before we can fully understand diseases that affect information transfer in the brain. My dissertation aims to clear up this confusion by taking a very detailed and careful approach. In my work, I attach a special label onto the machine. That label gives me information on what the machine looks like at the position I have placed the label. Through this work, I have been able to identify that one of the machines is likely interacting with the others in 2 unique steps. Therefore, this finding provides a possible explanation to some of the conflicting data that has been published in this field. It is my hope that my research, combined with the hard work of many others, will help make 1 in 6 go to 1 in 600. Thank you.
Great. So sorry, I was just going to say before you play that, Sam. So we're going to watch all of these and then talk about them. Is that right, Sam?
Yep, but I think for the next 2, maybe we'll just focus on the first beginning part. But I think it was nice to see Abigail's full arc and how she came back around.
Yeah, so so this is going to be an example of a rhetorical question. And then the next one is going to be an example of projecting into the future. So so think about how those are being used to kick off these.
All of us are users of infrastructure. Is there anybody in this room who could claim that they don't rely on roads and streets, bridges, sidewalks, or buildings in their daily lives, say for going to work or for sending their kids to school? However, we all have experienced that unpleasant ride on a bumpy road or bridge with huge cracks or potholes. But have you ever hit the same pothole on the way to work every day and wished you could just press a magic button and make it disappear? Wouldn't it be great? That's what my research is about. But before that, how big is this problem? Well, crumbling US infrastructure is a popular talking point in political campaigns and the news. But
I believe wind energy is the future. It's great for the environment, it's virtually limitless, it promotes energy independence and diversity. There's just one drawback. It's expensive. If it were cheaper, it would be everywhere. So, let's make it cheaper. Making wind energy cheaper is as simple as making wind turbines bigger. The longer blades sweep through a larger area, generating more power. They're also higher up in the atmosphere where the wind is stronger and holds more power. Manufacturers build wind turbines as big as they can. They can't make them any larger. The blades are so long, about 200 feet, they have to be made incredibly strong and incredibly stiff. If they're not strong enough, they'll break, and if they're not stiff enough, they'll bend backwards, hit the tower, and that is even worse. Wind turbine blades, they're about as strong and as stiff as you can make them, so you can't make them any longer. Or can you? Nature is a wonderful engineer and has already addressed this problem for us. In trees, wind turbine blades are a lot like oak trees. They're strong and stiff and heavy, but when the wind blows hard enough, we've all seen them come crashing down.
I want to play that one a little bit through as well too, because then you get to hear the analogy that was also used as well in this presentation. So we've got the links embedded into the presentation, and of course these are all on the PhD Plus YouTube site as well too, so you can access them. Let's switch back over.
Yeah, so Abigail, the first one that we watched, she actually won last year's competition. So she's a great person to learn from, and she uses a number of these techniques to structure her presentation, beginning with this story about her grandfather. So she starts with that 1 in 6 number that demonstrates or quantifies how prevalent this disease is that she's looking at. And then she immediately follows that up with her own personal story to put a personal face to that 1 in 6. And it's something that, given the prevalence of this, probably a lot of us can relate to, that this is just so prevalent that it's hard not to know somebody who's been affected by something like this.
Yeah, and she is the hero within her research story as well. And you're cheering for her, hopefully by the end, to actually have that success, to make 1 in 6 into that 1 in 600 that she's referring to. And you visually get to see that change in the way she's animated the slide.
Yes, and then the rhetorical question also is great because it again asks us that question that puts us in a position to think about something that is a very common experience. And it evokes that common experience. So you're thinking about your commute on your way to work and that pothole. I know exactly what pothole I often almost hit on my way to work, and puts it on that human level and helps us understand the exact problem that his research addresses. And then
when I hit it the next day, I wish that I could pull up my cell phone and actually hit that button.
Yes, yeah. And then projecting into the future, the very, very first sentence, very briefly, of that last presentation was that wind energy is the future. So how do we make that happen? So he has a very firm statement that this is the future, and yet here's all of the problems that are keeping it from being the future now. And that's why I'm doing this research, to make this happen in this specific way. So all of those grab us either, very, very briefly with that last one in order to build into that bigger description of the problem, or a more kind of drawn out story like Abigail's that helps kind of bring us into this world a little bit more slowly, but still keeping it within that 30-second mark that Sam talked about for the opening.
So Kelly introduced this at the beginning, but just as a reminder of what we wanted you to think about, and then how it's going to incorporate into the next activity that we want you to do in this final 20 minutes or so of our session today together. We wanted you to kind of back out, think about that satellite view of your research, how it connects to others, how it relates to current events, pop culture, etc. We wanted you to think about like the big societal issue or the big picture problem that your research is trying to address, what that issue is, any unknown aspects that you're trying to work towards. And then finally, something that might not be obvious to someone outside your discipline. So you're keeping in mind those pieces, those maybe 2 or 3 things that you need to share, you might have to have on your slide to complement that story that you're talking about. And what we want you to do, and we're going to put you into breakout rooms to actually have these conversations a little bit, is we want you to think about kind of these 3 questions. We'll put them into the chat so you have them as well. But think about what led you to the topic that you're working on, what inspires and motivates you, what your typical day is of doing research. Is that in the lab? Is that in the library? Is that punching away on your computer? Is it staring into a microscope or a telescope? Like, think about what that is like, where that's happening, and how you might describe it for your audience. And then we'll pitch you into breakout rooms. So we just want you to talk through this. There's no specific structure of the story you need to tell. You don't necessarily have to have a full story arc, but we want you to share your research and how that might relate to your 3-minute presentation. One at a time, and kind of get feedback. You can get feedback on the structure, or how you might be able to hook your audience with analogies, what might be a good example of the story arc that you could tell, how you might empower your audience to have an action afterwards. So think about that and give each other constructive criticism. So you can have about 3 minutes to discuss. We'll send out a message when it's time for you to be able to switch. So make sure you give yourself some time to discuss and provide feedback. We'll have the other person present, discuss that, and then we'll bring you back together as a group. So really encourage you to go through these conversations. I know every time that we use breakout rooms within a virtual meeting, people hop off or are scared, run away, whatever that is. But stick around, have this conversation. This is going to be more like a one-on-one conversation. So it'll really be helpful to get you the brain, start thinking about some of these ideas. So with that, Kelly, I'm going to hit escape. I'll put these think about parts into the chat, and then we'll send people into breakout rooms. Great. Well, thank you all for doing that. I know it can be really helpful. I love grabbing a couple friends, a dry erase board, some pizzas, and like thinking about how I craft presentations, stories, et cetera, for these types of events. Actually just doing that in kind of a collaborative space. So we really encourage you to keep conversations like this going with your friends, with family, with people in your lab, et cetera. So you can think about like, what's the best way to frame your research story for your grad thesis line presentation. We have 2 questions because we've gone ahead and deleted one out of the PowerPoint, so you won't see the first one. But we have 2 questions that we just want to kind of openly ask the group. So feel free to actually answer these by unmuting yourself. Because it'd be really curious to think about like what these are. And the first is there something that you wish you would have had as a prop, as a visual on a slide, as something you could have pulled out of your pocket that would have actually helped you tell the story in the example that you were just giving in the breakout rooms? Anybody willing to share? Is there something that would have been really useful? I see some pondering going on. I'll say for reference, last year, we did have one student, I think some of you have seen this, that actually pulled out, basically the instrument, the thing that she had created as part of her graduate research, something that was like CD sized with a swab, actually like, take a blood sample, and was able to actually act that out, right? So think about what you're able to potentially bring in that way, whether it's a prop or something that you put up on the slide at a proper time. Mel, you have an example?
So in my research, I look at the politics and economics of migration, and specifically, I look at return migration. So when someone who migrates to another country returns to their country of origin. And a lot of people are always surprised when I tell them that actually the majority of migrants become return migrants. Most people, when they think of migration, they think of examples like, Italian Americans or Irish Americans who come here and settle and form this identity in the United States as sort of like this longstanding group. But when I think of myself as a migrant, and when my discussion partner thought of himself as a migrant, our plan is actually to one day return to our country of origin. And so I would really like something like a graph or something like that that visualizes, how many people return to their country of origin versus how many people are first-time immigrants in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, I could even think of examples where you use headlines to like reinforce that narrative, but then put a giant stat up, like 75% of migrants actually go back to, their country within X number of years, right? And you really like put that paradigm right on its head right away. So that could be kind of a fun way to do it, and just pull out the most important stat. You might not even need the graph. It might just be the actual number that is so different than what we might normally think of. Thank you for sharing. We want to be mindful of time. I know it's right at kind of the end time. So something for you to think about is what the story you shared, did it accomplish actually communicating your research in this context that we're thinking about? Like, was it the right example? Was it the right kind of story to tell, the right character development for yourself? Did you describe enough the background that this is something that you could actually use, or do you need to continue to refine this? Kelly and I fully expect that your first idea that you might have just used in the breakout room is not necessarily where you're going to come down and what your final presentation is. That's why we start this session so early, and that's why we have these opportunities for you to reflect, think about, and kind of practice throughout the series. With that, we have some recommendations, some kind of homework assignments leading into session 3. So what we want you to do is kind of continue these conversations, continue the reflection, think about other story options that you might have, other engaging aspects of your research that maybe you didn't include within the breakout rooms, and think about that. Practice it. Think about what your hook could be, test it out with your friends, find that dry erase board if that's helpful, or just find a place where you can get together, have a beverage or two, and kind of talk through some of these ideas. Reflect on what that takeaway message is, or the hook that you think you might go towards, right? And how you empower your audience. So think about the beginning and the end of the presentation. We'll come back more to the script and how you fill in the important details in the middle. And as you start to do that, kind of outline this, put it down on paper so you can start to think about where you're going to start, what those words are. Don't accidentally, think of something brilliant in the middle of the night and then lose it. Try to capture this as you go through and start to put the structure, even if it's like an outline of your script together. And then start drafting your slide. Think about what that visual is. So what is that number? What is that newspaper clipping or something that you might want to put up on the screen? Start to think about what that might look like. And come to session 3 with a very rudimentary kind of draft of what that might look like. And we'll start to think more about how you can leverage it. Happy to stay around and answer questions for anybody who has them. We can continue to do that. But just a reminder, don't forget, if you haven't registered, make sure you go ahead and register as well.
Probably if you found your way here, you've registered. But
Probably. But if you're watching this online on the website, don't forget to register. From there, we won't stop recording yet, but with that, we will cut it off if people want to stay around and ask questions that aren't recorded as well too. So any questions you'd like to ask to the group before anybody hops off? And if you have to leave, we totally understand.
Thanks, guys.